who is going to be the next president. The Honduran people decided that, having exercised their choice between two supporters of the military coup that ousted the elected president. As often in the past, the U.S. separated itself from almost all of Latin America, and in this case even from Europe, in this brazen act of contempt for democracy and human rights. In the wake of the Brazilian coup of 1964, a monstrous plague of repression spread through the hemisphere. It included what's in Latin America is called the first 9/11, namely in Chile in 1973, which by any objective measure was far more severe than what we call 9/11. It included the killers and the torturers in Argentina, who were Reagan's favorites. It finally reached Central America through the 1980s. In the course of the terror and slaughter, the practitioners of liberation theology were a prime target, among them the martyrs of the church, whose execution 20 years ago is now commemorated with a resounding silence, barely broken. Forgotten almost completely are Julia Elba and Selena. The one survivor of the massacre, Father Jan Sobrino, reminds us that they are the symbols of the suffering masses of El Salvador and indeed of the world. There's been much debate about who deserves the credit for the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was also the topic of a recent meeting in Berlin of the three presidents most directly involved. Germany's Helmut Kohl concluded the meeting by saying, "I know now how heaven helped us." George H.W. Bush generously praised the East German people who for too long had been deprived of their God-given rights. Gorbachev suggested that the U.S. needs its own perestroika. There are no such doubts about the demolition of the attempt to revive the Church of the Gospels. The School of the Americas, now renamed, which is famous for its training of Latin American killers, proudly announces as one of its talking points that liberation theology was defeated with the assistance of the U.S. Army, given a helping hand, to be sure, by the Vatican, using the gentler means of expulsion and suppression. The bitter campaign to reverse the heresy that was set in motion by Vatican II, that has received incomparable literary expression in Dostoevsky's Parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this tale, as I'm sure you know, set in Seville at the, I'll quote it, in the most terrible time of the Inquisition, Jesus Christ suddenly appeared on the streets, softly, unobserved, and yet, strange to say, everyone recognized him and was irresistibly drawn to him. The Grand Inquisitor, recognizing the grave danger, bids the guards take him and lead him away to prison, where the old man accuses Christ of coming to hinder us in our great work of destroying the subversive ideas of freedom and community. We have taken the sword of Caesar and follow him, not thee, the Inquisitor admonished Jesus. We seek to be the rulers of the earth, so that we can teach the weak and vile multitude that they will only become free when they renounce their freedom to us and submit to us. Then they will be timid and frightened and happy. So tomorrow I must burn thee and put an end to thy evil ways. But finally the old man relented and let him out into the dark alleys of the town. The prisoner went away. Notice that the pupils of Fort Bragg learned a rather harsher lesson. In 1977, the highly respected Jesuit priest Rutilio Grande preached in El Salvador of his fears that very soon the Bible and the Gospels will not be allowed within our country. We'll get the covers and nothing more, because all of its pages are subversive. And I fear, my brothers, that if Jesus of Nazareth returned, they would arrest him. They would take him to the courts and accuse him of being unconstitutional and subversive. His insight into policy was all too accurate. A few weeks later, he was assassinated, again by the same hands, first of the series of assassinations in Central America of Jesuit priests. Well, these two events, the collapse of Russian tyranny and the destruction of the evil ways of the Gospels, were linked symbolically when the hero of 1989, Václav Havel, came to Washington shortly after the assassination of his Salvadoran counterparts. He spoke before a joint session of Congress, and he received thunderous applause when he praised the United States as the defenders of freedom. The intellectual classes were entranced. At the extreme dissident end, Anthony Lewis hailed Havel for teaching us that we live in a romantic age. The Washington Post described Havel's message as a voice of conscience that speaks compellingly of the responsibilities that large and small powers owe each other. And others wondered why American intellectuals do not ascend to these lofty heights. Well, one can imagine the reaction if the circumstances had been reversed. It's a thought experiment that is useful to carry out. Could teach us a lot about ourselves. Well, let's turn to the second track, policy. How did policymakers react to the fall of the wall, initiating the Unipolar Moment? A few weeks later, the United States invaded Panama. The purpose was to kidnap a minor thug who was brought to Florida and sentenced for crimes that he committed, for the most part, while on the CIA payroll. He had switched from valued friend to evil demon by dragging his feet on supporting Reagan's terrorist wars in Nicaragua. There were official pretexts, but they were so thin that they were refuted instantly. I won't insult your intelligence by going through it. The invasion killed several thousand poor people, according to Panamanian human rights investigators. There are no official U.S. sources. We don't do body counts, as General Tommy Franks, the conqueror of Iraq, explained. The invasion reinstated the rule of U.S.-backed bankers and narco-traffickers. In fact, narco-trafficking went way up. It's commemorated by a day of mourning in Panama. It was hardly more than a footnote to history, but it did have some new features. One of them was explained by former State Department official Elliot Abrams, returned since. He pointed out that this was the first time the United States had been able to intervene without concern for a Russian reaction somewhere in the world. And other prominent commentators elaborated. They pointed out that with the Soviet deterrent gone, the U.S. would be free to resort more readily to force, violence, and subversion to achieve its global aims. Another novelty was that the invasion of Panama could not appeal reflexively to the communist threat. It's a couple of weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So a new pretext was needed, and it was quickly supplied. It was the threat of Hispanic narco-traffickers seeking to destroy the United States. The drug war had in fact been declared by Richard Nixon for interesting reasons that I have to put aside, but it took on a new role as the Unipolar Moment dawned. And similar considerations guided the general formulation of policy after the collapse of the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy aiming for world conquest, borrowing John F. Kennedy's phrase. Within months after the fall of the wall, Washington outlined its new course. In brief, everything will stay very much the same, but with new pretexts. So we still need a huge military system, but for a new reason. The technological sophistication of third world powers. Nobody laughed. It's called the independence of the intelligentsia. We still have to maintain what they call the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry. We're not allowed to concede that we're very far from a free market economy. The high-tech economy relies very heavily on the dynamic state sector, much of it under Pentagon cover. We must maintain intervention forces directed at the Middle East energy regions, where the, I'm quoting, where the significant threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. That's contrary to decades of deceit. No apology. All of this and much more like it was passed over quietly, barely even reported. But for those who hope to understand something of the world, it's pretty instructive. As a pretext for intervention, the war on drugs was far too narrow. A more sweeping mission was needed, and the intellectual community quickly turned to the task. They declared what was called a normative revolution that granted the U.S. the right of humanitarian intervention, as it chose, for the noblest of reasons, but that's by definition. The traditional victims were unimpressed, to put it mildly. Conferences of leaders of the global South immediately and bitterly condemned what they called the so-called right of humanitarian intervention. Their stand was upheld by a high-level UN panel in 2004, in this case with leading U.S. figures participating, among them former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and the distinguished Australian diplomat Gareth Evans. A refinement was therefore necessary. And again, the intellectual classes rose to the occasion, devising a new doctrine, responsibility to protect. It's familiarly known as R2P. It's now the topic of a substantial literature, many conferences, new organizations, academic journals, and much praise. And the praise is in fact justified, at least in one respect. We may recall Gandhi's response to the question of what he thought about Western civilization. He's alleged to have said that it would be a good idea. And the same holds of R2P. It would be a good idea. On that, I think everyone should agree. But then the usual problems arise. Just what is R2P, and when does it apply? Well, on the first question, what is R2P, there are two versions, which are commonly, in fact, systematically conflated in the West, but they're quite different. One was given formal expression at the United Nations World Summit in 2005, and a radically different position is articulated in the founding document of R2P. That's the report of an international commission in 2001, of which the leading figure and spokesperson is Gareth Evans. The World Summit, UN World Summit, basically reiterated positions already adopted and in fact implemented by the United Nations, at most with a sharper focus. The summit in particular adopted the persistent, unchanging stand of the World Court, the Global South, the high-level UN panel, namely the stand that forceful action can only be carried out under Security Council authorization, with an exception that's irrelevant, although it did grant the African Union a qualified right of intervention within the African Union itself. Now, if that exception were generalized, the consequences would be intriguing. For example, Latin American countries would be authorized to carry out large-scale terror in the United States to protect victims of U.S. violence in the hemisphere. Well, the conclusion is immediate, but never drawn for some odd reason. In any event, we can put the African Union exception aside, although it is commonly adduced by proponents of R2P to try to show that it's not an instrument of imperialism, but rather is rooted in the South, as it is in the World Summit version of R2P. Well, that's one version. The second version of R2P in the Evans report differs fundamentally from the Summit Declaration. In its crucial paragraph, the Commission authorizes action within area of jurisdiction by regional or sub-regional organizations subject to their seeking subsequent authority from the Security Council. Now, this is 2001, and the paragraph was plainly crafted to apply retrospectively to the bombing of Serbia, just what was forcefully rejected by the Global South, the high-level panel, and the World Summit version of R2P. This provision of the Evans Commission effectively authorizes the powerful to use force at will, and the reason is quite clear. The powerful unilaterally determine their own area of jurisdiction. The Organization of American States and the African Union, they can't do that, but NATO can and does. NATO determined that its area of jurisdiction includes the Balkans, but interestingly not NATO itself, where shocking crimes were committed against Kurds in southeastern Turkey right through the 1990s. It's all off the agenda because of the decisive military support for them by the leader of the free world, Bill Clinton. NATO later determined that its jurisdiction extends to Afghanistan, as you know, and also beyond. Officially, it now extends to protection of pipelines, sea routes, and other crucial infrastructure of energy systems on which the West relies. Now, these expansive rights granted by the Evans Commission are in practice restricted to NATO alone, radically violating the principles of the World Summit. And they explicitly open the door for resort to R2P as a weapon of imperial intervention at will. Well, let's turn to the second question. How is R2P applied in practice? The answer will surprise no one who has the slightest familiarity with history or elementary understanding of the structure of power. I'm not going to run through the highly selective application. It's exactly as you'd expect, but just take a few examples. There's no thought of devoting pennies to protect the huge numbers of people dying from hunger and lack of health care. That's at a level far higher than Rwanda, probably twice the Rwanda level, among children alone, and not for 100 days, but every day and increasing. Victims who are protected populations by law, protected populations are also barred from protection, among them the victims of the U.S.-Israeli attack in Gaza early this year. They are protected persons under the Geneva Conventions, but they're not part of the responsibility to protect. Victims who are the direct responsibility of the Security Council also are unable to appeal to R2P. The most striking case is Iraqis subjected to Clinton's murderous sanctions, which were condemned as genocidal by the administrators of the UN programs, the respected international diplomats Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck, who successively resigned in protest against these violations of the Genocide Convention. So they're not protected. Also not protected are the victims of the worst massacres of recent years in the eastern Congo, and only the cynical might suspect that the neglect has something to do with the fact that the worst offender is U.S. ally Rwanda, and that multinationals are making a mint from robbing the region's rich mineral resources with the crucial aid of the militias that are tearing the place to shreds. Anyone who has a cell phone is a beneficiary, and on, exactly as the rational would suspect. Well, returning to the dawn of the unipolar moment after the fall of the wall, another question that came to the fore right away was the fate of NATO. Now, its traditional justification had been defense against the Russian hordes. So with the USSR gone, pretext evaporated. Naive souls who had faith in prevailing doctrine and believed what they were taught in school would have expected NATO to disappear as well. Quite the contrary. NATO quickly was expanded to the east in violation of pledges to Gorbachev, and as I just mentioned, it's since been expanded well beyond to a global intervention force under U.S. command. One motive, very likely, we don't have internal documents, but very likely that one motive is to prevent Europe from pursuing an independent course, and perhaps along Gaullist lines. That's been a primary concern of U.S. planners since World War II. More generally, policies during the unipolar moment and up to the present have kept very closely to the guidelines that were devised by FDR's planners during World War II. They recognized that the United States would emerge as the dominant global power, displacing Britain, and accordingly they developed plans for the United States to exercise control over a substantial portion of the globe. This grand area, as they called it, was to comprise, at a minimum, the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, and the Far East. And in the grand area, quoting them now, the U.S. would hold unquestioned power and would act to ensure the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with its military and economic supremacy. That's Roosevelt. Note the similarity to the Bush doctrine that outraged articulate opinion 60 years later. And review of the intervening period reveals that the same doctrines prevailed and in fact still do. A good illustration is Bush's immediate predecessor, Bill Clinton. It's regarded as a centrist moderate, pretty much Obama's model. Under Clinton, the U.S. officially reserved the right to act unilaterally when necessary, including unilateral use of military power, to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. That's without even the pretexts of self-defense on which the Bush neocons insisted. The Clinton doctrine elicited no condemnation or maybe even comment, unlike the arrogant and contemptuous proclamations of the Bush administration, and rightly, because it just reiterated long-standing positions and it was presented with polite restraint. In the early days of World War II, Roosevelt's planners thought that Germany might prevail in Europe, but as Russia ground down the Wehrmacht, the vision became more expansive. The grand area was to incorporate as much of Eurasia as possible, at least Western Europe, its economic heartland. Detailed plans were developed for world order, and they were soon implemented right after the war. Each region was assigned what was called its function in the U.S.-dominated global system. So, for example, Southeast Asia was to fulfill its major function as a source of raw materials for Japan and Western Europe under the U.S. aegis. The South in general was assigned a service role. It was to provide resources, cheap labor, markets, investment opportunities, more recently other services such as export of pollution and waste. That's what's happening in Somalia right now. At the time, the U.S. was not much interested in Africa. So Africa was handed over to Europe to exploit, it's the word that was used, for its reconstruction from wartime destruction. That happens to be George Kennan's phrase. One can imagine different relations between Europe and Africa in the light of history, but these were not considered. They violate the imperial culture. In contrast to Africa, Middle East oil reserves were recognized to be a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. It was the most strategically important area in the world, in Eisenhower's words. Control of Middle East oil would provide the United States with substantial control of the world, top democratic planners recognized, and those principles remain in force. With regard to Latin America, post-war planners concluded that the primary threat to U.S. interests is posed by radical and nationalistic regimes that appeal to the masses of the population and seek to satisfy the popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. And these tendencies conflict with the requirement of a political and economic climate conducive to private investment with adequate repatriation of profits and protection of our raw materials. Ours, so God happened to place them somewhere else. Mysteries of providentialism. And later on, it wasn't just radical and nationalist regimes, but also this heresy of the effort to revive Christianity, pre-Roman Christianity. And a large part of subsequent history flows from these conceptions. Support for harsh dictatorships proceeds unchanged. As President Obama set off to deliver his highly praised Cairo speech, he hastened to explain that he did not regard Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak as an authoritarian leader. In his words, "I tend not to use labels for folks." When a political leader uses the word folks, you know you're going to shudder at what comes next. Obama obliged. He praised Egypt's brutal dictator as a force for stability and good in the Middle East. Just as in the past, support for democracy and for human rights keeps to the pattern that scholarship has repeatedly discovered, standard schizophrenia, correlating very closely with strategic and economic objectives. It's small wonder that outside the West, very few take U.S. charges against Iran very seriously, and not only the alleged concerns for human rights, which doesn't reach the laugh meter, but also the primary charges that Iran is concealing something from the International Atomic Energy Agency, as it doubtless is. Others are concealing nothing at all. For example, the three countries that have never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, India, Pakistan, and Israel, all of which have relied on the United States, on U.S. support for their nuclear weapons programs. At the peak of the recent furor about Iran, India announced that, quoting, "it can now build nuclear weapons with the same destructive power as those in the arsenals of the world's major nuclear powers," which means Pakistan will try weakly to match it. At the same time, the International Atomic Energy Agency passed a resolution calling on Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to open up its nuclear facilities to inspection. Well, the U.S. and Europe tried to block the resolution, and when they failed, they voted against it. It passed anyway, and President Obama hastened to assure Israel that the U.S. would support its rejection of the resolution. The White House also assured its Indian ally that it can ignore Security Council resolutions on nuclear weapons, crucially the most recent one, Resolution 1887 on September 24th. That resolution, you may recall, was hailed as a great victory for Obama and his conflict with Iran. But if you bother to read it, it's short. You can find it on the internet. It said nothing about Iran. It was directed against the United States, Israel, and India. Obama reacted to Resolution 1887 not only by telling India that they can ignore it, but also in a different way. 2 days after he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his inspiring commitment to peace, the Pentagon announced that it was accelerating delivery of the most lethal weapons in the arsenal, short of nuclear weapons. These are 13-ton, kiloton bombs to be delivered by B-52 stealth bombers. They're designed to destroy deeply hidden bunkers shielded by 10,000 pounds of reinforced concrete. And there's no secret about what they're for. Planning for these massive ordnance penetrators, as they're called, began in the Bush years but languished until Obama came into office and rapidly called for accelerating the development, which is now happening. They've been accelerated by several years and are supposedly coming into the arsenal very soon. Well, these comments barely scratch the surface of the formation and implementation of policy during the unipolar moment, but I think they're characteristic. One significant element is the continuity of planning and interpretation since World War II, when the United States shouldered the responsibility that was eloquently described by Winston Churchill, the responsibility to protect the interests of the satisfied nations whose power places us above the rest, the rich men dwelling in peace within their habitations, to whom the government of the world must be entrusted, now under Washington's guiding hand. And that remains the operative meaning of the fashionable phrase, responsibility to protect.